I told myself that moving to Briarwood would erase the noise. New streets, new routines, a smaller apartment with thin walls and quiet nights, everything about the town felt deliberately ordinary, and that was exactly what I needed. After years of emotional chaos, ordinary felt like mercy. I arrived with 2 suitcases, a second-hand couch, and a promise to myself that I would not repeat old mistakes. I was done chasing feelings that burned too hot and disappeared just as fast. Daniel Harper made that promise feel reasonable. He had been in my life for nearly a year, steady as a metronome, gentle without being dull. Daniel listened more than he spoke, cooked dinner without complaint, and never asked questions he wasn't prepared to hear the answers to. When I told him I wanted to move, he didn't resist. He simply said he could make anywhere feel like home. I believed him, or at least I wanted to. Our relationship had grown from relief rather than passion. Daniel had found me after a collapse I didn't like to name, when I was exhausted by longing and disappointment. With him, there were no emotional spikes, no sleepless nights replaying conversations. We fit together quietly, like pieces chosen for stability instead of beauty. Some days, that felt like love. Other days, it felt like settling, and I hated myself for wondering which it was. Briarwood welcomed us with polite indifference. The neighbors waved without curiosity, the streets emptied early, and even the sky seemed less demanding. I found work at a local design firm within weeks. The office was modest, the projects uninspiring, but the predictability helped me breathe again. I told myself healing didn't need excitement. It needed time. Maya Collins became my anchor almost by accident. She worked 2 desks down from me, sharp-eyed and effortlessly warm, the kind of person who noticed details others missed. On my second week, she handed me coffee without asking how I took it, and somehow got it right. We started having lunch together, trading small truths disguised as jokes. Maya never pushed, but she listened in a way that made silence feel safe. At home, Daniel and I slipped into routine with alarming speed. Evenings blurred together, dinner, television, quiet conversation that rarely strayed beyond logistics. He touched me with familiarity, not hunger, and I told myself that was what grown love looked like. Still, there were moments when I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the calm staring back at me. Calm, I realized, could also be a kind of numbness that I tried not to think about my past, but it lingered like a song you can't quite forget. There had been someone before Daniel, someone who had taught me how deeply I could feel and how badly it could hurt. I told myself that chapter was closed, sealed off by distance and time. Briarwood was supposed to be the proof that I could move forward without dragging old ghosts behind me. The first crack in that belief appeared on an unremarkable Thursday afternoon. I was reviewing a client brief when the office door opened, and conversation briefly paused, the way it does when a stranger enters a familiar space. I looked up without interest, expecting another delivery or a late interview candidate. Then I saw Lucas Reed. Time didn't stop, but something inside me did. He stood near the reception desk, older than I remembered but unmistakably the same, dark hair cut shorter now, confidence worn like a tailored jacket. His presence altered the room, not loudly, but with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly who he was. For a moment, I wondered if exhaustion had finally blurred my reality. Lucas's eyes lifted, scanning the office, and then they met mine. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something more complicated. Surprise, yes, but also caution, as if he'd stumbled into a memory he wasn't sure he wanted to revisit. My name stayed trapped in my throat. I felt exposed, as though every careful decision I'd made since leaving my old life had been undone in a single glance. Maya noticed my stillness immediately. "You okay?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the noise in my head. I nodded too quickly, breaking eye contact with Lucas and forcing myself back to the screen in front of me. Words swam uselessly. My pulse refused to slow. I reminded myself that Briarwood was small, coincidences inevitable. Seeing him didn't have to mean anything. People from your past didn't own your future. Lucas spoke with the receptionist, his voice lower than I remembered, steadier. I caught fragments: consultation, short-term project, relocation. Each word felt like a thread pulling him closer into the space I had so carefully rebuilt. When he laughed, quietly, I felt it in my chest like an old ache waking up. He didn't approach me. That restraint made everything worse. Part of me wanted confrontation, clarity, some acknowledgement that this wasn't just my imagination. Another part prayed he would leave without another glance, allowing me to pretend this encounter had been insignificant. Instead, as he turned toward the exit, Lucas looked back once more. His gaze held mine for a fraction longer than before, long enough to communicate something unspoken and unsettling. Not longing. Not regret. Recognition. As if he knew exactly what his presence was doing to me. When the door closed behind him, the office returned to its rhythm, but I couldn't. Maya watched me with quiet concern, and I knew she was cataloging the change in my posture, the tension in my jaw. I offered her a weak smile I didn't feel and told myself I just needed air. That evening, Daniel asked how my day had been. I told him it was fine. The lie tasted harmless, almost necessary. As he talked about his plans for the weekend, I nodded at the right moments, but my mind replayed Lucas's expression over and over, searching for meaning I wasn't ready to face. I went to bed beside Daniel, listening to his steady breathing, and realized with a sharp, unwelcome clarity that my fresh start had never been as secure as I believed. The past hadn't chased me to Briarwood. It had simply waited until I was comfortable enough to lower my guard, and now that it had found me, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to run, or finally turn and face it. Days passed after that first encounter, and I couldn't shake Lucas from my thoughts. Every detail, the tilt of his head, the faint crease by his eyes when he smiled, the way he seemed both familiar and foreign at the same time, haunted me. I tried to immerse myself in work, to let the predictable rhythm of Briarwood life soothe me, but the world suddenly felt smaller, as though it existed solely to remind me of him. I caught myself scanning the office entrance for signs of him, rationalizing it as mere curiosity, but deep down I knew it was more than that. It wasn't long before our paths crossed again. A client meeting at a nearby cafe, an accidental collision in the grocery store aisle. I told myself coincidence, but the frequency made it feel orchestrated. Lucas never imposed. He approached with measured words, his voice calm but edged with a subtle familiarity that unsettled me. "Ethan," he said one afternoon, tilting his head slightly, "I didn't expect to see you here." That simple acknowledgement ignited a spark I wasn't prepared to feel, and I realized just how much control I thought I had over my emotions. I told Daniel nothing. At first, I convinced myself these were just chance encounters, harmless in their fleetingness. But the truth was that I had begun to crave them. Lucas had a way of looking at me that bypassed all my defenses, as if he could see the cautious, measured part of me that no one else did. With Daniel, our evenings were safe and calm, but with Lucas, there was tension, charged, silent, impossible to ignore. I felt like a teenager again, experiencing the raw pull of someone who challenged every rule I had made for myself. Work became an intricate balancing act. Maya noticed my distraction almost immediately, though she never asked directly. One morning, as I stared at my screen and ignored her casual greetings, she leaned over and whispered, "Something's going on, isn't it?" I forced a laugh and shook my head. "Just tired, that's all," I lied. But I could feel her eyes studying me, assessing the truth behind my carefully constructed facade. She had a way of noticing what I tried to hide, yet her tone carried concern rather than judgment. I envied that about her. It reminded me that honesty, even when painful, could be grounding. The more I saw Lucas, the more complicated everything became. His presence resurrected memories I had buried, but it also stirred desires that weren't just about the past, they were about who I was now and what I craved. He asked questions that were never casual. "Do you like it here? Are you happy?" His words weren't prying, they were deliberate, probing into spaces that Daniel had never tried to touch. With Daniel, love was predictable. With Lucas, it was terrifyingly real. And I realized that safety and excitement were not interchangeable, they were fundamentally opposed. Lucas never forced me into conversations I wasn't ready to have. Our discussions started small, work, mutual acquaintances, the odd observation about the town. But slowly, they shifted, becoming more personal, intimate without ever crossing physical boundaries. He shared parts of his past, carefully curated fragments that revealed both vulnerability and resilience. In turn, I found myself revealing details I hadn't spoken aloud in months, pieces of myself I didn't even know I missed sharing. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once, and I hated that I enjoyed it so much that I noticed changes in myself that I couldn't ignore. My laughter was sharper, my posture more alert, my focus on Daniel's plan sometimes absent. I would replay our encounters in my head, analyzing the way Lucas had looked at me, the tone of his voice, the subtle gestures that made my pulse quicken. These were not thoughts I could share with Daniel, not without betraying the trust he had placed in me. And yet, I could not suppress them. It was a quiet, insidious form of infidelity, emotional rather than physical, but it weighed heavily on me. Daniel began to notice the subtle shifts. He didn't confront me outright, but he started asking questions with a gentleness that made avoidance difficult. "Are you enjoying your work?" he asked one evening, voice soft. I nodded, aware that my response lacked the conviction it should have carried. He gave me a small smile but didn't push, and that restraint was more painful than accusation. I realized then that he trusted me completely, and the guilt of my divided attention gnawed at the edges of my conscience. One evening, Lucas invited me to a quiet dinner under the guise of a professional meeting. I hesitated, my heart and mind battling over the consequences of accepting. Finally, curiosity won. Sitting across from him in the dimly lit cafe, I felt the air between us thrum with unspoken tension. He spoke about his recent move to Briarwood, subtly implying that his presence was no accident. Every word, every glance carried a dual meaning, the casual and the deeply personal, the past and the present colliding in ways I had not anticipated. I left the cafe feeling both exhilarated and guilty, aware that each step closer to him took me further from the stability Daniel offered. The weeks unfolded in this pattern, a delicate dance of proximity and restraint. Lucas's presence became a gravitational pull I could neither resist nor fully acknowledge. My heart raced in his vicinity, yet I knew the danger of indulging in the feelings he evoked. Daniel remained patient, unassuming, a quiet anchor in the storm I refused to name. And all the while, Briarwood's calm streets held the illusion of safety, a fragile mask that I knew could shatter at any moment. By the end of the month, I recognized the inevitable truth: my fresh start was no longer under my control. Lucas had introduced an element of unpredictability that I couldn't ignore, no matter how I tried to rationalize it. My emotions were tangled, my loyalties divided, and the simple life I had hoped to build with Daniel was suddenly complicated in ways I wasn't prepared to navigate. For the first time in weeks, I realized that healing might not be linear, and that sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, appearing when least expected, forcing choices I was not ready to make. And yet, despite the chaos he brought, despite the guilt and confusion, I couldn't deny the pull. Lucas Reed had walked into my life, unannounced and uninvited, and with one simple presence, had made everything I thought I knew about myself feel fragile. That night, as I lay beside Daniel, pretending to sleep, I acknowledged the truth I had been avoiding: some people don't just complicate life, they redefine it entirely. And I had no idea if I was ready for the consequences. I tried to convince myself that what was happening with Lucas was harmless, just moments of shared conversation, fleeting connections that didn't threaten the life I'd built with Daniel. But the truth was unavoidable: I was investing in him emotionally in ways I hadn't allowed myself with anyone else. It wasn't about passion, not yet, but about intimacy, the kind of understanding that cut deeper than words and lingered long after he left. Every encounter with Lucas felt like a confession without speaking, a mirror reflecting parts of myself I thought I had abandoned. It started subtly. Lucas would text with casual timing, asking about small details of my day or work, almost innocuous questions that carried the weight of attention. I found myself smiling at messages I had no business enjoying, feeling a rush of anticipation that I hadn't felt in years. When we met in person, our conversations became longer, layered with unspoken meaning. He would brush a stray hair from my forehead or catch my gaze for a heartbeat too long, and I felt my resolve weakening in ways I had promised myself I would never allow. That I hadn't intended to keep secrets from Daniel, but the compulsion came naturally. I stopped mentioning Lucas casually, avoided describing our accidental meetings, and downplayed my distracted moods. Daniel noticed, though he didn't accuse me. Instead, he watched, quietly, with the patience and care that had always defined him. One evening, while we cooked dinner together, he paused mid-chop and said, "Ethan, is something going on? You've been distant lately." I forced a laugh, hiding the swirl of guilt and confusion inside me. "I'm fine. Just stressed at work," I said, and he accepted it without pressing. But I could feel the disappointment lingering in his eyes, subtle yet unmistakable. Lucas began to push boundaries gently, testing the space between curiosity and confession. One rainy afternoon, we found shelter under the same awning, the streets glistening with water and reflections. He asked about my past, my regrets, the choices I had made that led me here. I answered honestly, more than I intended to, revealing fragments of vulnerability that I hadn't shared with Daniel. Lucas listened with the kind of attention that felt like recognition, as if he understood not just the words but the unspoken fear behind them. It was intoxicating and terrifying. Then came the revelation I hadn't anticipated. Lucas's friend, Oliver Grant, dropped by the office one morning while Lucas was away. Tall, easygoing, with an almost mischievous glint in his eye, Oliver had a way of speaking that implied knowledge without outright confession. He asked about my background, the places I had lived, and the people I had left behind. At first, I dismissed it as idle curiosity. But then, casually, he mentioned Lucas's previous connection to someone who had moved to Briarwood recently, someone matching my description. The implication hung between us, unspoken but undeniable. Lucas hadn't been here by accident. He had sought me out. The weight of that realization unsettled me. My rational mind screamed that I should step back, protect what I had with Daniel, and restore the fragile stability of my life. Yet every fiber of me longed to confront the truth, to understand why Lucas had come, why he had appeared now, after all this time. It wasn't just attraction, it was unfinished history, unresolved tension that demanded attention. I felt trapped between caution and curiosity, my moral compass oscillating with each heartbeat. That I began spending more time with Lucas, each interaction pulling me further from the life I had promised to nurture with Daniel. We met at quiet cafes, walked along empty streets, and lingered longer than necessity required. We spoke of trivialities, books, music, work, but beneath the surface, the conversation flowed into confessions and regrets. I told him about my past heartbreak, the mistakes that had shaped me, and the fear that I might never fully heal. He responded with patience, understanding, and the rare ability to see the man I was beneath the careful exterior. Daniel's absence during those moments became palpable. He continued to offer stability, but I realized that he couldn't compete with the intensity of a connection that challenged me at every level. I felt guilty, endlessly so, but also alive in a way I hadn't anticipated. The moral dissonance gnawed at me, loving Daniel, respecting him, yet feeling drawn irrevocably toward Lucas. It was a silent betrayal, a breach of trust without words or actions, and it weighed heavier with each encounter. Then, Lucas confronted me directly, unexpectedly, one late afternoon in the park where we had begun to meet under the guise of coincidence. "Ethan," he said, voice low and precise, "I didn't just run into you by chance. I needed to see you, to understand what's between us, what never ended." The admission struck me harder than I expected. My chest tightened, my mind raced, and a flurry of conflicting emotions erupted: relief, fear, longing, and guilt, all tangled together. I realized that the careful boundaries I had maintained were gone. There was no longer space for denial. That evening, I returned home to Daniel and felt the stark contrast between the two lives I was living. Daniel spoke quietly about work, asked about my day, and shared a plan for the weekend. I nodded, listening but hearing only fragments of what he said, my mind replaying Lucas's words. The weight of secrecy pressed against my chest. I loved Daniel in my way, respected him, valued the calm he provided, but I could no longer ignore that a part of me existed only in the presence of Lucas. My emotional world had split in two. On one side, the stability, kindness, and patience of Daniel; on the other, the unresolved intensity, the vulnerability, and the familiarity Lucas brought. I couldn't reconcile the two, couldn't find balance. The simple truth emerged: my heart was already compromised, not by choice alone, but by circumstance, coincidence, and the magnetic pull of someone I thought I had lost forever. By the end of that week, the tension reached a peak. I found myself standing alone at the edge of the park, rain soaking through my jacket, watching Lucas's figure fade into the distance. His presence had shifted something irreversibly inside me, opened a door I could not close, forced questions I wasn't ready to answer. I realized that whatever path I chose next, there would be no returning to the uncomplicated life I had tried to build. The past had found me, brought with it a reckoning I could no longer postpone, and so I faced the undeniable truth: healing was no longer a matter of moving forward quietly. To move forward would have to confront what Lucas stirred inside me, and that meant risking everything I had worked to protect. My life, my love, my sense of safety, all were hanging in the balance, and I was left to decide how much I was willing to lose to discover who I truly was.